Welcome to this special edition of LegalAF. This is the midweek edition. I'm your host, Karen Friedman Agnifilo, and I'm thrilled here to have my friend and former colleague, Joan Illuzzi Orbon. Joan was a prosecutor at the Manhattan DA's office for 33 years, was it, Joan? And
yes, 33.
And so I've worked with Joan for a very, very long time. And Joan is, I used to call, part of the thoroughbred racehorses of the Manhattan DA's office. She was one of the go-to trial attorneys when you had a really serious case or a really big case. She tried some of the biggest cases in the office that I'm excited that she's agreed to be here to talk to us about. Hi, Joan. Welcome.
Hi, Karen. How are you? Karen, for those people who don't know, was my boss at the Manhattan DA's office, and one couldn't ask for a better supervisor and boss. She not only was brilliant, but also gave people the freedom to think for themselves and encouraged people to soar in whatever capacity they can at their job.
Well, it's very, very nice of you, but today's about you, not about me. And so when thinking about sort of talking to Joan and talking to you about your incredible career, there's been so many cases that you've tried and won that it was hard to decide which ones to choose from. And so the two cases that come to mind that were really, at least to me, just incredible victories and incredible trials that you did, investigations and trials. One was the kind of, I guess it was 50-year-old case involving Etan Patz. There was this young boy named Etan Patz who in 1972 went missing. And he started the Missing Children Act and the sort of movement. And anyone who remembers children on milk cartons, that started from the Etan Patz case here in Manhattan. And that case went cold for the better part of, since 1972, they never could solve the case, right, Joan?
Yeah, it was actually 79, but since 79 until a DA Vance came in and asked his staff to re-examine and look into the case, had very little to no activity.
And how old was he? Do you remember when he went missing?
6 years old. He was born in 1972 and went missing in 1979. His first day walking to the bus stop. His first day walking to
school, right?
His first day walking to the bus stop by himself, which was only a block away in front of a little bodega. Yeah.
So if I remember correctly, there was a civil case against a kind of notorious child molester, Jose Ramos, I believe, right?
Yes.
And they thought he was the main suspect. But then when you and the Manhattan DA's office, when we all engaged in this investigation, why don't you tell everybody sort of what happened and how it ended?
So Jose Ramos was a likely suspect. He was a known pedophile who frequented the area where Etan went missing. So he was a likely suspect. But when you really examine the evidence against him, it was like a house of cards. It wasn't as solid as people had always assumed because he just sort of fit the profile of somebody who would have done this and was really crazy and said crazy things, but none of which was that he had killed Etan. And then what happened is that the DA looked into it again, asked the police department to look into it again. And there was one person who was of interest in the case who the police felt that they had never fully examined and explored a certain area of his house. So they actually began to dig in the basement of a carpenter who worked on the block and who had given Etan $1 to help him paint, quote unquote, paint the day before. And while they were doing that, one of the relatives of Pedro Hernandez, the person who actually kidnapped and killed Etan, called up and said, I've been trying to tell people for years. My brother-in-law did this. He was working at the bodega. He was very young. He was in his late teens. And he saw this beautiful boy and he brought him down to the basement. He had given various versions of why he did it. But he strangled him to death, put him in a plastic bag, put him in a box, and brought him approximately a block away to a basement area in the box after he was dead.
And how was that solved? I mean, obviously it was the brother-in-law came forward and said, I think this is my brother-in-law, but what happened to then bring a case that you could bring to trial?
Well, once we started looking into it, we examined the people who this man had been speaking to for years. And it turns out this man was telling people what he had done. It was a little bit vague at times, and he wasn't exactly doing it to get caught, but more relieving his conscience. And then the police met with him and spoke to him, and he fully confessed. Wow. He fully confessed. And everything that he said, Karen, was bore out by the facts. You know, he had said he put the box down at basement steps, but that a gate had been moved. And we found the man who moved the gate in 1981, something that that Pedro Hernandez would have never known, because he left the area never to come back after this happened.
Wow. So I think this is kind of an important, interesting thing that people would love to hear more about, which is, just the idea that that a reinvestigation isn't just, we sort of do a reinvestigation of the guy that everyone thought did it. And I think books were written about Jose Ramos being the killer, and that there was this whole, if I remember correctly, there was this whole, like, people had what they would call evidence that Jose Ramos did it. And I think there was even a civil suit where he was declared in a civil court as the perpetrator of them in a wrongful death action. Like, there are a lot of litigation over the years went into Jose Ramos. And I think what's really fascinating is, prosecutors really, when you guys and us, I guess, reinvestigate a case, it's not, you really start fresh. You don't have any preconceived notions. You don't have any sort of, I'm going to prove that Jose Ramos did it. Instead, we're going to look and see, just start the investigation over again. And I think that's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about the trial. So there was more than one trial, right?
Yes, sadly, we tried that case twice.
Why is that?
The first time it was 11-1 for conviction against Pedro Hernandez. And the second time there was a conviction against Pedro Hernandez. What's interesting, Karen, is that to get back to what you were just saying, is that Mr. Morgenthau, who of course was, the DA for many, many years prior to both of our boss. Yes. He had the information that everyone else did about Jose Ramos and declined to prosecute him. He knew it just wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough. So I was really happy to look at it with fresh eyes. There were thousands and thousands of police reports and FBI reports that we really had to comb through. We had a wonderful team. And I had fresh eyes because, of course, I wasn't even in the office at the time. I was in high school when Etan disappeared.
Yeah, I understand. And so tell us a little bit about kind of what goes into a trial that old. I mean, there was no DNA, there was no video, there was nothing, right, that you have today. How do and you talked about calling the guy who put the gate in from 1980, whatever you were saying about the gate guy. Like, yes. Tell us a little bit how you try a case and what kind of evidence you put in a case that is that old. It's very interesting. It really is, because what you do is you gather all of the information about what happened that day. And then it's a lot like storytelling. And I don't mean storytelling because it's fake, it's a story. I just mean in storytelling in a way that jurors can understand one progress to another and one step to another, and to really paint the scene of what happened, particularly when it was such a long time ago. Remember, there were no traffic cams. There were no videos to present there, aside from his own confession. There wasn't technology. There was no cell sites. So when you think about all the things we have and the tools we have today to present to jurors, it's quite and vastly different than the way we have to try this case. This case is about the people. This case was going back and reaching back all those many years late before and finding some people who remember certain things, finding people who were documented as going certain places and saying certain things. And it was remarkable about how great people's memories were, how consistent they were with what they remembered before, how important it was, right? Because you'll forget the face of the person maybe who brings me groceries tonight.
because it's a non-event. But if you did something on the cusp and right before a child went missing and it was traumatic for you, you'll remember. Trauma is stored in a different part of the brain. And so we were able to bring back a lot of people who really had great, concrete memories and evidence about what happened.
So it's a little bit like putting a puzzle together.
That's exactly right. I mean, I had a list of 100 people who I thought could completely and fully tell the story, and then, eliminated a few that I thought were repetitive. But for the most part, we called dozens and dozens of people because we needed the jury to know everything that we knew about this case.
And you also had to, one of the things I thought was interesting about your trial was you had to disprove certain things, right? You had to disprove.
Sure.
Go ahead. Tell them the things you had to disprove.
Well, we had to disprove the fact that Jose Ramos was seen in that area that day, that Jose Ramos actually committed this crime, or what he said was just sort of nonsense or cryptic and had nothing really to do with Etan. So we had to disprove that he was the person of interest and say, although he fit the profile, it was not the likely suspect. It just wasn't.
Was that in your primary case that you did that, or was that on rebuttal?
Oh, it was both.
It was both. Didn't you also have to? Didn't you have to prove that Etan was dead? I mean, or that he wasn't just sort of runaway or missing, and that because weren't there sightings of people who thought had sightings? And didn't you have to also? Wasn't that a part of this as well?
So sure, that's exactly correct, right? Because you have to prove that the crime was committed at all. And if Etan was still alive, obviously the crime wasn't committed. So we had to explore some of the more interesting or somewhat realistic options of people who said they had seen Etan, or that they were Etan, or they thought they knew Etan. It was sad because, we get phone calls from people who would say, I just saw him in the grocery store and he's such a beautiful little boy. And they're calling us 30 years later, not appreciating or not thinking about the fact that Etan would no longer be a child. He would be an adult. But
Didn't
there was no realistic
DNA? Didn't you do a DNA test of someone who thought he might be Etan? Or
there was a person who unfortunately was mentally ill who believed he was Etan for many, many years. And in order to prove to him that he wasn't Etan, I think that there was a DNA sample taken.
So Pedro Hernandez was convicted, right? And got 25 to life. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, finally bringing some sense of closure and relief to that poor family that truly never gave up on their child. Never. They never gave up.
They suffered so badly. I mean, first of all, the loss of a child is something that no parent ever gets over, and difficult to know when and how they could take their next step. But this was worse because they didn't know, was their child being abused? Was their child chained to a radiator somewhere? Was their child sex trafficked? They had no idea what happened to this poor child. And so every day was a living nightmare. They'd go to sleep and wake up in the same nightmare.
Didn't they leave their phone on? They kept the same phone number, right?
Kept the same phone number.
He would call,
kept the same address, kept the same apartment. After all of our trial and everything was done and said and done, they were finally able to move on with their lives. Yeah. Unfortunately, Julie, for a very short period of time, she died about a year after the verdict. But yes.
Tragic. That's so tragic. But you know what, Joan, you and Cy Vance, frankly, really brought just closure to this family that never got it before. And so it was just that it was such a meaningful, incredible prosecution. So
I had a lot of help, right? We had Joel Simon, who was such an experienced and thoughtful DA. He did a masterful job with the psychiatrics evidence in the case. That second round, we had Penny Brady, who was also just a wonderful and brilliant partner. James Vinacore. I mean, I can go on and on. There are just so many people to thank.
That's great. That's really great. Love them all. Great lawyers. So moving on to a case that I think happened a little more recently that has really captured the nation, the fascination of the nation, and that's against Harvey Weinstein. So I'd love to talk about that. That was a case that in 2017, dozens of women came forward and reported that he had sexually assaulted them. And I think in 2018, he was arrested in New York, and Joan was the lead prosecutor on the case. I'm sure she'll talk about her team because she's so humble. She never takes credit for anything. But, Joan, you were the lead prosecutor in the case, and you brought it to a successful resolution. And just last week, the trial was upheld on appeal. And, there was some really kind of edgy sort of walking a fine line calls made in that case. So I'm sure you breathed a sigh of relief that it was upheld on appeal. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that case, about the trial, and what that was like, and what that meant to you?
Yes. Unfortunately, I didn't have the benefit of your counsel on that trial, and I don't think we have since really ever spoken about it. I had a wonderful team there too, just incredible people like Harriet Galvin and Megan Haas. They're just, one is a brilliant writer. The other one is just a stick of dynamite in a courtroom. Harvey had great counsel. He had, Donna Rotuno. He had Damon Chironis. He had Arthur Adala and Barry Kamens and Diana Fabi. He really had a terrific team as well. So he certainly got his day in court. The thing about the trial, though, is that I could tell you that really just strikes me is that I think it's an awakening for people. It's an education for a jury to know that there are really no perfect victims. Who's a perfect victim of a sexual assault? No one. Nobody knows quite what to do. It takes a while for the brain to absorb what's even happened to them. Most people, a vast majority of people, are raped by an acquaintance, not by a stranger. There are, of course, those rare instances where you hear that, women are attacked on the street and what have you. Those are the exceptions, not the rule. Most women are raped by somebody that they know, sometimes a relative, sometimes their own partner, sometimes an ex-partner, a business associate, someone in authority. There's a power dynamic that's often there, like a priest or a teacher or a boss at work. And so women are traumatized by it. And that trauma translates to them thinking to themselves, did this actually just happen to me? What was this? What do I do about it? What if I do sort of shout out what just happened to me? What will the implications in my own life be? Will I be fired? Will I be dismissed as crazy? Will I be blacklisted? That's what the women here were afraid of. Harvey Weinstein was a powerful person in Hollywood. And so it was important for us to acknowledge the fact that women have a way to be able to relate to a jury and to prove their case without even so much a stitch of physical evidence. It's important to educate jurors on the impact of rape trauma. And so we did a few things that were sort of thinking outside the box here. And that was, number one, we called an expert in rape trauma, a psychiatrist who had treated many, many victims of rape and rapists themselves, in treating them and figuring out, what makes people tick and what makes people act in this way. So she was able to educate the jury on issues like, you think that a rape victim doesn't then reconnect with her rapist, because they do. A lot of women, so traumatized, are looking to put it in the rearview mirror in any way they can. And they think by just sort of having some kind of relationship with their rapist, that this will be a way for them to be able to normalize the behavior. I don't have to be so traumatized by this. Maybe this wasn't so horrible. But in the end, it really, it pushes it down for a little while, and then it constantly is bubbling up, affecting the future of all their other would-be healthier relationships. So that's one thing women do. The other thing is that women don't tell many, many times. like I said, there's so many things that roll into someone's head. Will I be believed? Do I have physical evidence? What is, will this person be believed over me? Was there anything in my behavior that is now going to be scrutinized? When you're the victim of a rape in an open trial in court, you're being sort of scrutinized. Your whole life is exposed. It takes a brave person to say, I know my truth and I'm going to speak truth to power. And in doing so, it actually is the most healing thing they can do to take their next step in life and get past it in whatever way they can. So I really applaud the women who came forward. They came forward and particularly one who just said, look, I know I'm not a perfect victim. This is the way I dealt with this terrible, terrible trauma in my life. I dealt with it the best way I could, but I'm here to tell you this man raped me. And it was just so touching.
How many charged victims were in your case? And then how many, tell everybody what Molyneux is and how many Molyneux victims.
So in the end, he was convicted of sexual assault against 2 women, but we were able to charge him with sexual predator based upon the brutal rape of a woman years and years earlier. He was acquitted on that charge. But I think, of course, you don't know what's in the jury's mind, right? But I think he was acquitted of that charge because they figured it was just so long in the past. But it was nevertheless palpable. And I think that woman's testimony significantly contributed to what happened. So
how did she feel, by the way? Did you talk to her after the verdict that he wasn't found guilty of her? I mean, yes, he was found guilty and he's going to go to prison, but did that impact her at all that they didn't find him guilty of?
I think she was terribly disappointed because she felt as though it followed her for many, many years. And she was so completely and utterly innocent in a terrible thing that happened to her. But she's strong and she's smart. And she truly feels good about herself to have given and contributed, to have spoken up so that other women don't have to go through the same thing. And that was what she contributed. But there are also women. So when you speak about Molyneux, right? Molyneux is other acts, other bad acts that somehow we inform what happened in the charged acts, right? So it could be the person's intent. It could be lack of mistake. It could be modus operandi. There is no modus operandi in sexual assaults, and that the case law is clear there. But here, we were able to do 2 things. Bring up instances where Mr. Weinstein was sexually offensive and assaultive to the people we charged in other instances. And the court allowed us to call 3 women who were not charged because they were out of the statute of limitations, that we couldn't charge their case, but who would say that they were also sexually assaulted. Not to show that he had a modus operandi, but to show instead that he knew he did not have consent. None of these sexual assaults was a quid pro quo for getting ahead in a film or getting a part or getting successful in the business. And he knew it. He was intimidating and brutal to people, and he didn't care about the effect it had on them. So we're able to call those 3 women in addition to talking about other instances with the women who were charged.
So let me get this straight. So with the women who were charged, there were certain rapes that you were able to charge as separate counts in the indictment. Like on this date, he forcibly raped her. On that date, he forcibly raped her. But what you're saying is there were other instances of sexual assault that weren't charged, either because they weren't in the jurisdiction of Manhattan,
right,
or because they were beyond the statute of limitations, because you can only prosecute, the Manhattan DA's office can only prosecute things that happened in Manhattan. So you're saying in order to bring out those other prior kind of bad acts that are uncharged, you needed to ask permission of the court in what's called a motion in limine, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you did that under a Molyneux theory.
That's correct.
Okay. And so Molyneux.
And also res geste, which is basically a fancy way of saying to look at the whole picture, to look at the entire dynamic between two people.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. There's a fine line between Molyneux evidence and, this sort of proving intent through these other acts, and then kind of crossing over the line of you're really trying to show there's a propensity for this person to commit a crime, which obviously, that's we all know, and anyone who watches even, legal television knows you can't, that's inadmissible. How do you thread that needle between overly prejudicial propensity evidence versus probative towards proving intent in a sexual assault case? How did you do that?
Right. We certainly don't want the jury to be confused that we're trying to show, hey, listen, he did this on one day to one woman, so he must have done it to our charged victim. So we chose cases and instances where the facts were different. They didn't closely reflect exactly what he had done with the charged cases. So the people were different. The interaction and the location of the interactions were at times different. But instead, we showed something about him, what was in his mind. Because let's face it, when two people are engaging in a sexual, act, there is an issue of consent. How do we know someone's consenting? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we know someone's consenting. He knew people were not consenting. He knew
look, one of the sexual assault myths that was, I think, mentioned in the decision that I think is really, in the court decision that just came down, is that women fight back, and I was a sexual assault prosecutor for many, many, many years as well. And, of course, they're not going to fight back. So in addition to being raped, you're also going to be beaten and choked and punched and, hurt in other ways. Like, of course, you're not going to necessarily, when you're going to be overpowered by this person because they're physically, Harvey Weinstein was much larger than his victims. That's what the decision, when I read the decision, that's one of the things they pointed out. He was much larger than them. And, of course they didn't fight back because they're going to lose. And so why add injury to injury?
Well, they were certainly petrified. And a lot of people react differently than you would think on paper, a victim would react. Women lose their voice. They would try to scream and couldn't scream.
And a lot of them freeze, right?
They were petrified because they thought, even if I fight him off, how am I getting out of this place? Yeah. Is there someone else here that's going to block me? And like you said, am I now going to have further irreparable harm done to myself and my body than what is happening now? But they were clear that they didn't want it. He was clear. He was forcing it. And so the charges go.
What was the trial like? Because there was media attention. I remember just going to work every morning and there'd just be, cameras and trucks and lights and people and the media. You couldn't open a newspaper or, anything without sort of seeing the intense media attention. Was this the most media attention you ever had in the case, or was Etan Patz? What case had the most media attention? Was this it?
I don't know. It's kind of hard to say, but certainly the media attention here was great. There were people lined up in hallways, lined up to get into the courtroom. And that is generally unusual in our practice for people to be sort of, and all the reporters to be in the hallway and what have you.
So how do you deal with that as a prosecutor?
I ignored it completely.
You just tune it out, right?
Tune it out. There are so many things going on in the well, which is, where all the parties are seated, and the jury and the judge and the court reporter and the court officers in that box right in front of the courtroom. So to me, there were so many things that I needed to pay attention to go in the well that I sort of ignored what was going on behind me. Although I know that it was very important to the women who testified that people came to support them, and came to sort of cheer on is the wrong word, but to be there silently supporting them and giving them some confidence in what they had to do, the terrible task that they had to engage in. And I don't blame the defense lawyers at all. They certainly put us through our paces, which is exactly their job to do. So he had a very aggressive defense team, which was fine with me. And I think that he sat there at times stone-faced. I don't know what was going on in his head. I don't know if he thought the whole thing was silly. I don't know if he thought that he certainly wasn't going to get convicted. But what won the day, Karen, was the brutal, raw honesty of these witnesses.
And it just came through in their testimony.
All the cards were laid out. Everything there was, good, bad, or indifferent, was put out to the jury to, and the jury obviously saw that. And I think that for sexual assault victims, as difficult as it is to go forward and testify, for them, they are then free. To whatever capacity you can be freed of a terrible event, they were freed from this after they stood up for themselves.
And did these survivors know each other before the trial?
No.
And did they get to know each other during the trial?
Well, we introduced them on the day of sentencing. We invited them. We invited them to the DA's office, and they were able to meet each other.
Wow, that must have been powerful.
Oh, really, really great. Really, just life affirming.
How long was the jury out for?
That's a very good question. They were out overnight, and I don't remember for how much longer, but it wasn't terribly long. It wasn't terribly short either.
And
they thought about it.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Bill Cosby was prosecuted for sexual assault, and there too they put a Molyneux evidence in. And wasn't that case reversed because of the Molyneux issue?
No, people think it was reversed because of the Molyneux issue. Absolutely
well, clearly,
not.
Since I'm one of those people.
No, it was reversed because a prior DA sort of insisted that Mr. Cosby testify about some of these events and promised him immunity from criminal prosecution. And so that immunity was said to have been indelible. I know that it is once again on appeal, but it had nothing to do with the Molyneux witnesses. And in fact, the same expert testified in the Cosby case that testified for us, Barbara Ziv, fabulous expert, articulate, and really reached the jury.
That's great. Well, congratulations on the conviction being upheld. I'm sure not that you had any doubt, I'm sure, but it's still got to be a little bit of a relief, right?
Of course. The appellate division was very thoughtful. They examined carefully every single issue and really stuck to the facts and the law. And I think in doing so, gave people confidence in the law. That's for sure.
So you were the whole time I was there, you were this great trial lawyer who tried so many amazing homicides. And I don't think you ever lost a case, by the way. You had a lot of great success and great trials, but then you became a supervisor at the end. You became chief of the trial division, which is, I think, the best and hardest job in the office. How do I know? Because I had that job once,
yes.
But you're the head of the unit that has about 350 to 400 lawyers in it, that handles every single arrest made by the NYPD, for as sort of small as stealing a pack of gum to as high as murder, terrorism, sexual assault, and everything in between. What did you think about being a supervisor versus, being the one to do it yourself? Like, what was that like for you?
I loved it. It was another side of the things that I loved about being in the DA's office. I love the investigation. So to be able to listen to a set of facts and suggest 10 avenues of investigation was great. I got to know a lot of colleagues that I don't think I would have ever crossed paths with. I got to know aspects of the law that I hadn't dealt with myself. And work with people. I really just loved working with the fabulous lawyers at the Manhattan DA's office.
So you walked out when Cy Vance was no longer DA, right?
Yes.
So not that long ago, less than a year. And what are you doing now?
So I am doing a few things. I, believe it or not, I have an agent who I'm hoping is able to get me more jobs and speaking jobs and what have you to further educate the public on what it is to be a prosecutor and what it is that we do. I also am a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, so I do a little writing for them. And lastly, Karen, I am trying to sort of land at a firm that will take me off counsel, where I could, and this is my greatest wish, where I could bring women in who have been sexually assaulted because it's not too late. Governor Hochul has signed a bill to Adult Survivors Act that has given a 1-year look back on all sexual assaults, irrespective of whether or not the case was taken. The case couldn't have been taken because of barred by the statute of limitations. And
in the state of New York.
In the state of New York, it's a 1-year look back. And I know that prosecutors, former prosecutors like you and I, are just the right people to be able to listen to what women have to say, examine the facts, examine the evidence, and perhaps give people the justice and the closure that they need to put the terrible event in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, no, it's the New York did that with children in 2019, where with the Child Victims Act, where they did a 1-year look back, and that was an incredible thing. And I'm so glad that this new governor, Kathy Hochul, who's really terrific, by the way, I really like her, is doing this now for adults. I think it goes into effect 6 months from the day it was signed, and I think it was just signed a few weeks ago. So I think we all
that's correct.
Yeah, so you and I have 6 months to gear up to figure out how to do these cases. Because
I hope people contact us. Yes,
yeah,
I hope people contact
they
us.
Will.
Because I think, again, it is a nod to now the world is educated more to understand how it is that sexual assault victims do not come forward immediately, and why they don't come forward immediately.
Yeah, well, in 2019, New York extended the statute of limitations for the statute of limitations, as everyone knows, is the time from the time something happens to the time you bring a case. You have a certain amount of time to do that. But it's both civil and criminal. There are statutes of limitation, and there was a statute of limitations that was extended for civil sexual assault cases in 2019 for 20 years, and that's recognizing the fact that a lot of women aren't willing or able or mentally prepared to come forward right away. All the things you talked about that earlier about that Dr. Ziv talked about how people sort of go through all sorts of different reactions after a sexual assault, whether they blame themselves, will people believe me? This person's more powerful than me. They could ruin my life, all that. Right. There's a lot of people who just don't have the ability or the strength. I'm always I have so much admiration for people who have the strength and courage to come forward, because frankly, the criminal justice system especially can be really traumatizing to victims, just the cross-examination and telling their story over and over again and risking the jury not believing them. I mean, I can't really blame certain people who say, it's not worth it. I can't go through it. And so this recognized that the 2019 extension of the statute of limitations recognized that fact and extended it to 20 years. But that was only for cases from 2019 going forward. Yes. So there's all these cases from before 2019 where the statute of limitations expired. And some of them are going to be these Catholic Church cases. I mean, granted, those were mostly children, but there were some, some adults as well. But, teachers that, people, professors or your boss or, all these complicated relationships of people who
a distant relative, there are just so many cases.
All of that. And since the Me Too movement, I think, you were saying this, I think the Me Too movement really gave people the courage to come forward, right? Yes. That didn't happen before.
I just think that people sort of woke up and banded together to say, this has happened to so many women who perhaps haven't shared it with their partners or their families or their friends or anybody, because they doubted themselves, they blamed themselves for being in a situation when none of it was their fault, and they were just horribly victimized.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Joan, how can people reach you? How can all these people who, want you to represent them, how can they reach you? I know you'll land in a firm quickly, but in the meantime.
Yes, they can reach me through LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, and I could give you my email address. It's JIOrbon, ORBON @gmail.com. Okay. And I'm hoping that they reach out to both of us, because I think that you possess, that sort of institutional, long-standing knowledge of sexual assaults. And I think that we see how a path forward to proving these cases now that were never seen before.
Yeah, no, it's a really incredible opportunity. The Me Too movement, I remember where I was when I saw coming over the internet, the hashtag Me Too. And I just remember how powerful it was and how much it really, really changed things. I was a sexual assault prosecutor before the Me Too movement. And it's just the judgment that juries in particular, would kind of impose on survivors. Well, how come you didn't do fill in the blank? It was really hard sometimes. And that was re-traumatizing for people. But I think the Me Too movement has done an incredible service to educating the public as well as our legislators, which is why I think these laws are getting passed. And, hopefully people will finally get the justice that they deserve, because, it's such a difficult thing to live through, and it's, we call them survivors because they really are survivors, and I'm just always in awe of these individuals. Well, Joan, thank you so much for
Thank you for having me.
LegalAF. It's such a pleasure. As prosecutors, we're not allowed to talk publicly, right? We're not allowed to talk to the press. We're not allowed to talk to anybody, especially about cases or anything like that. So it's one of the things that is just really great about leaving is we can finally talk about these issues freely and openly, and to get to have the opportunity to have someone with a career like yours. We could go on for 2 more hours to talk about all your cases. Your cases were some of the most fascinating and impressive ones in the whole office. I mean, it's really your career has just been amazing.
The Manhattan DA's office, as you know, was a very difficult job at times, difficult to do, even more difficult to leave. And it's such it's opening an entire new world to us to be able to openly talk about what in fact is going on when crimes occur, and to educate the public more so that everyone feels as though we're all working together.
Well, thank you, Joan. And thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you.
Good to see you. Same here.
Shout out to everyone at LegalAF, the Meidas Mighty, and we look forward to this weekend with Michael Popok and Ben Meiselas.